Welcome to the Resilient Surgeon, part of the STS Surgical Hot Topics podcast. Our goal with the Resilient Surgeon series is to inspire our colleagues to be their best selves in and out of the operating room, using scientifically proven tools and recovery strategies of the world's top performers. I'm Dr. Michael Maddaus, and in each episode, I will talk to game changers who will share evidence-based practices, real-world strategies, and their own personal stories and experiences to help you build your resilience and to help you be your best self no matter what. Our guest today on the Resilient Surgeon is Dr. James Danckert, and the topic is boredom. And to be just as lame as possible, I hope you will not find the interview boring. Dr. Danckert is a professor of cognitive neuroscience in the Department of Psychology at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and the co-author with James Eastman of the fascinating and eye-opening book, Bored Out of My Skull. James first became interested in the issue of boredom after his brother suffered a serious brain injury, leaving him plagued by struggles with chronic boredom, even when he was doing the things that he loved before the accident. Now, boredom is something we all experience, but it may not be as ubiquitous in the lives of cardiothoracic surgeons as it is with others, since our careers do offer endless stimulation and engagement. But boredom still pops up through the crevices of our busyness to strike at different times and in different ways. In my case, at about age 54, I started to feel bored with many aspects of my career, including the act of operating. I felt guilty about my boredom, so I ignored it and did not talk about it. So we can become bored by the bigger projects and direction of our lives. But we can also get bored over and over again, day in and day out when we are idle, even for a few minutes, like when we're waiting in line at the grocery store. Two extremes of boredom, but the signal is the same. Your brain is, like the plant in the Little Shop of Horrors movie, saying, "Feed me, feed me." Well, boredom strikes when we want to be doing something but don't want to do anything currently on offer, making us feel antsy, restless, or sluggish and listless. But we are unsure of what will satisfy because boredom can't tell us what to do either. In that sense, we are on our own. As humans, we need self-determined, effective connection with the world, and we need to be engaged and mentally occupied and give expression to our desires and our ability to exercise our skills and talents. In short, we have a strong need for agency. And when this need is fulfilled, we flourish. When it's thwarted, we feel bored and disengaged. So in that sense, boredom reveals an important aspect of being human. We have a strong need to be engaged with the world around us. In the case of my career, boredom was telling me that I needed to rethink what I was focusing on. It was time for an inventory of my life and career. Unfortunately, I did not know how to heed that signal. In the case of the checkout line at the store, it's a signal that can mean that we've lost the ability to be bored and sit with ourselves for even a few minutes. So what's the risk with boredom? Well, sugary, quick fix substitutes for true engagement. Think iPhone, TV, TikTok, Instagram, wine, food, sex. All that stuff is available to snuff out the unpleasant boredom signal in the moment. But such temporary salves never last, and boredom will return with a vengeance. And after that, it's up to us to embrace our agency. When boredom does strike, we need not fear. The trick is responding well to the signal. Since boredom is a call to action that says, "What should I do?" And now I bring you James Danckert. Well, James, thank you for joining us on the Resilient Surgeon podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here.
The pleasure's all mine. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, I want to quote you in your book as a lead in here, and I think it really sets the stage in a good way. And here you say, boredom confronts us with the simple yet profound question: what will you do? It demands an answer. There are few more significant questions, and I'll just add in life to the end of that phrase. And then I'm going to continue to read. In allowing our engagement to be determined by outside forces that have been engineered to capture and hold our attention and keep us from being bored, we become alienated from ourselves. In contrast, when the external forces recede, we have the possibility of finding ourselves, that is, discovering who we are, a necessary precondition for embracing our agency and rooting out boredom. This really struck me personally because I've had direct experience with both sides of that coin in my own life. I was a very busy and running 100 miles an hour cardiothoracic surgeon for 20 years, academic career and all the goodies. And then for a variety of circumstances, I had to leave clinical practice, physical ailments and the like, and bone issues. And I found myself at home alone during the day with my wife still at work and two children who were teenagers. And I was there, like all of a sudden, the brakes were slammed on. I ran into a cement wall of lack of activity, and I was bored. And I mean, I truly thought in the beginning that I was going to die. I mean, it felt like a near death to me. But over time, I discovered that quote from your book was absolutely true, because until that time, I really hadn't thought about who I was. I was a surgeon, pounding, working, I was a father, et cetera, et cetera. But who was Mike Maddaus underneath all of that? And I had really never thought about it carefully in my entire life. And this was the first window where the boredom and the aloneness forced me to kind of deal with that. So I just want to say that the boredom is a powerful conduit to understanding yourself if you really embrace its unique features. So that's my experience, and that's my takeaway from your book. And I just wanted to open with that. And if you have any comments around that, feel free. Otherwise, I'll just go on with the questions, and you can use that as a backdrop to anything you want.
Yeah, I think not a ton to say right off the bat. It's a great story. And I do think that we can have a tendency to be propelled without thinking what's propelling us. And we just move on from one thing to the next because that's what we've always done. And that's what we think we should always be doing. And we don't pause and take the time to consider those difficult questions of, why am I doing it and what matters to me most?
Yeah.
And so John and I, in writing the book, did want to put that across, that boredom gives you the opportunity to answer that question, however difficult it is, what matters to me.
Right. Yeah. And that's certainly worked for me. Well, James, how did you come to study boredom? And the pun and the fun thing, were you bored? I mean, obviously.
So I do like the Latin quote, the medice curate ipsum, which is the physician heal thyself. So yes, I do suffer from boredom, a lot worse in my 20s and 30s than I do now. But I really disliked the experience. I really hated the experience. And I still do. It doesn't happen as often. It's not as intense. But when it descends on me, I find it uncomfortable, restless. And, in my early days of researching boredom, thought that maybe I'd be able to find a way to conquer it, to get rid of it. But now, having worked through it and done a lot of research on it and worked with John on the book, I think that's the wrong kind of thinking to try and eradicate boredom. I think instead what you want to do is just learn how to cope and respond to it. The second thing that got me into boredom research, it was a little bit more personal. So when I was a much younger man, in my late teens, early 20s, my brother had a traumatic brain injury from a motor vehicle crash. And he got through that. It was pretty serious brain injury. And he got back to a point where he was living his life and was gainfully employed and so on. But he would report being bored all the time. And he was bored by things that used to be engaging to him. And it was around about the time that I started getting fascinated about the brain and human behavior. And so it all really clicked into place there to say something organically in his head had reset his thresholds for enjoyment, reset his thresholds for how he engaged with the world. And so I just wanted to understand that more. I wanted to know more about it.
Yeah, cool. And then, so what is boredom? What the hell is it? What's the scientific definition? Is it a feeling? Is it an emotion? Because there is a distinction between emotions and feelings. So, where does this sit on the scale there?
It's a great point to say that emotions, moods, feelings are distinct things. So my co-author, John, he would talk about boredom as a feeling state. It's not quite an emotion. And he would talk about it as feeling your thinking, right? So it's the feeling of thinking, right? You are having some thoughts about whatever is happening in the moment. And whether or not you're bored or engaged will tell you whether or not those thoughts are occupying your resources, your neural resources, your brain resources effectively or not. I do like, so that's maybe a bit into the weeds more than I would normally get when people ask me what is boredom. I
It is
tend
a
to
little
go
in the
to,
weeds, yes, but that's good. I love the
yeah,
weeds.
yeah, I tend to go with the Tolstoy quote, which I think you would have seen in the book, is that the boredom is the desire for desires. So when we're bored, we want to be engaged with the world. We want to be doing something that matters to us, but it's pretty obvious to us that we're not succeeding at that moment. And the reason why I really like the desire for desires is because it highlights the conundrum of boredom for people who suffer from it a lot, right?
Mhm.
The easiest story for that, though, I think comes when you think about young children coming to their parents and saying, I'm bored. What we typically do as parents is we have that knee-jerk reaction to offer all of these possible solutions to their boredom. Why don't you go play with your brother? Why don't you go play basketball? Why don't you do some Lego? Why don't you read a book? Why don't you do whatever, right? I mean, all of my answers are a bit anachronistic, you know. I mean, most kids nowadays will say, let me on my screen. But
Yeah,
whatever it
yeah,
is, all of those solutions you offer to your kid don't work because they can think of them. They're not stupid. They know
yeah,
what's available to them.
yeah.
What they're saying when they're saying on board is that they're saying they have a desire for desires. They've looked around, they've seen the options, and they don't want any of those options right now. And so that's the real conundrum of boredom, is that it's a wanting that you're not satisfying. You want to be engaged and you're just failing. And so that's also why it brings up this notion of agency, because when you're failing to engage with the world, it also becomes pretty obvious to you that you're not being a very effective agent. And that is, I think, part of what makes boredom painful.
Yeah. So you use the word painful there, and I just want to highlight desire for desires. So you're in a sort of a state, and the only desire you have is to feel desire to do something, to be motivated somehow to do something. Correct? Is that the right way to think about that?
Well, I think that boredom is a motivational state. So when you're bored,
Yes,
you are motivated. The problem is it's objectless.
it's
So
objectless. Yes, yes.
yeah. So it has no
Uh-huh.
content. You want to be doing something, but you can't figure out what it is. So when you tell your own story about having been a cardiothoracic surgeon, and then that comes to a grinding halt, the activities you were doing changed, but the desire to be doing something meaningful didn't. And so
Right,
that's why it
right.
felt like it came to a grinding halt.
And there were a lot of things I could do, but none of them appealed to me at the time.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Those are the desires. I desired to have some desire to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned the word pain, and I have to agree, it is sort of an aversive state, isn't it? What about it? Why is it painful, and what's the value of having that pain?
Yeah, I don't think I've met a lot of people who say that they never get bored, and I can come back to that if you're interested
Yeah,
in
sure.
think about that. I've
Yeah.
never met anyone who says they like to be bored, and I
Mhm.
think it's not a pleasant state. The reason why I think you're asking, why is it like that? I think it's like that because it serves a purpose. It has a function in our lives. And that function is to push you to explore, to find something better than whatever's available right now. And so if it wasn't painful, there would be no impetus to explore. If you sort of
Mhm.
got bored, and I think sometimes people who say, oh, I don't mind being bored, I've heard people say that, they're not actually talking about boredom. They're talking about just defrag time or downtime or being lazy or just
Right,
not bothering for a moment. Yeah,
right.
which is perfectly fine to have moments in your life where you don't really have any goals on deck at the moment. That's fine, but that's also not boredom. Like doing nothing is not boredom. Being apathetic is not boredom. Being lazy
Mhm.
is not boredom. So if you feel it in that aggressively restless way, then that's the thing that pushes you to act, to find something better. If it wasn't like that, then you just wouldn't care. So I think John talks about this. I'm not sure if he did in the book or not, but that boredom forces you to care. You have to care about
Mhm.
what you're doing, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, and one of the things that was great to explore when we wrote the book is that if you think boredom has a function, then you're sort of suggesting that somewhere in our evolutionary past, it was selected for. So other species ought to be bored, or to be able to be bored. And it turns out that that's true. So I mean, I think any of your listeners that have a pet dog would know when their dog gets bored, it usually winds up in some part of your shoe rack being destroyed,
Yes.
or your couch being destroyed or something.
I've had endless experiences with that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's tough for dogs, right? Like half the time they're at home with nothing to do. Yeah. So
Nothing to do.
you can't be upset with them for ruining your shoes.
No, I've always felt guilty about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't sure if I was projecting, but I sense that they are actually bored, you know.
Yeah, I don't think it's projection at all, and you can demonstrate it more scientifically than that. And so there's an experiment I love to talk about from Georgia Mason and Rebecca Meager. These are Canadian veterinary scientists, and they did a study in mink. And I don't know if you've ever seen mink in the wild, but they're mischievous animals,
No.
and they scamper around. They're quite active. They raised two groups of mink, one in an enriched environment that had lots of things for the mink to do and to play with, and one group of mink in a bland cage, which turns out to be the standard way in which they're housed before they're harvested for fur. So it's not great. But what they did then is that after 2 weeks of these of living in these different circumstances, they would then show the animals either things that they would normally avoid, so the smell of a predator or the shadow of a predator, things that they would normally like and they would approach. Apparently, toothbrushes are like the equivalent of a laser pointer to a cat. Mink just go crazy for toothbrushes for some reason. So they show them those things that they liked, or they would show them something that was neutral that didn't really matter. And their idea in this experiment was if the animals in the bland cages were depressed, they would show less interest in the toothbrush. They would show less interest in things they normally liked. If they were apathetic, they'd show no interest in anything. They wouldn't care, right? But if they were bored, they'd show increased interest in all of it, indiscriminately. And that's what the mink did. And so, you know, I think beyond that, there's other sort of evidence to suggest that you know, animals do get bored. And so it really does serve a function. It really is useful for us to have this boredom experience that then pushes us to act and to explore our world.
Yeah, and then the evolutionary impetus here, I think, was really beautifully highlighted by the story of the bushes and the berries.
Right.
If you want to
so
recount that, yeah.
Yeah, so we have, and we're not really different from many mammals or many other species of animal. We have these sort of twin drives, these two drives that we have to balance. So one of them is exploitation and the other is exploration. And so the easy way to describe these is to think about picking blueberries. And if any of your listeners have been to a pick your own berry farm, you don't stand in front of a berry bush and denude it of all its berries before you move on. You stand in front of the bush and you pick the ones that are sort of easily available to you, that look like they're big and juicy and ripe. You might stay for a little while longer, but at some point you move on because your brain is telling you there's potentially a better berry bush just to the right here or just around the corner, right?
Always searching for a little better one, yeah.
Yeah, and not that we should necessarily, you know, you can't go too far on either one of those drives. If you stand in front of that berry bush, and this gets back to evolutionary accounts too, if you stand in front of that berry bush and you're just solely focused on that bush, you open yourself up to predation because you're not paying attention to the world around you, and you run the risk of missing better resources elsewhere. But if you just keep bouncing around like someone with ADHD from one bush to the next and never really harvesting any resources, then you're probably going to go hungry. So you have to balance those two drives. And what boredom does is it sort of pushes you into that exploratory phase. It says, whatever you're doing now, what you were trying to exploit for whatever reason, and it's just not good enough. The berries aren't any good anymore. You've got to go somewhere else.
Do certain people get bored more easily than others? And that's a question for you, you know, and personally, I mean, I suspect that I was easily bored. I was in a very bad circumstance as a young kid. I was in a lot of trouble, a lot of impulse stuff, a lot of criminal activity, arrests and all the like. And then I became a surgeon. And over time, I found that, you know, as I moved from one sort of thing to another, I even developed significant, profound expertise at operations, so I could do them almost without thinking.
Yeah.
The boredom would set in on me like a cloud. It was like I would be driving to work and I would be thinking, I don't know if I can stand doing another 100 of these. all right?
Right.
Because it's become so routinized. But yet other surgeons, they love the specifics of the operation. They could do it a million times over. For me, it
Right.
was always, what's the next mountain sort of thing. I mean, I've done this, I've sort of mastered this. And that was part of my decision to even leave clinical practice, because I was sick and tired of it. I was just tired of
Right.
the whole thing, bored.
Yeah.
So it does happen, but there are surgeons who just, their joy comes from the perfection of each operation.
I think that highlights something that I think is really important about all of this, and that is the idiosyncrasy of it. That what makes one person bored is very different than what makes another bored, and that brings it back to it's essentially the same as happiness. What makes you happy is
Really is
idiosyncratic to you, it's
idiosyncratic.
unique to you.
Yeah.
And I had a conversation with Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut who led the ISS in the mid-teens of 20-teens. And we think, as just regular old people have regular jobs, we think cardiothoracic surgeon, astronaut, these are exciting jobs, right? This is a not, and particularly for someone like a surgeon, we've got so many medical television shows that are the dramas that, we just think that every minute of your day should be a tense.
It's nothing but thrills. Yeah.
Nothing but thrills, right? And of course, the truth of that is not, it's nowhere near the television portrayal of it. But even if it were, one can get bored of constant thrills. You could get bored of something because it's unchanging, just because it's tense and stressful. If it's unchanging, then it's going to be hard for you to, not for everybody, but hard for some people to extract that meaning out of it. And like you say, if I've done 100 of these, am I prepared to do 100 more?
Right. And that brings up the extreme circumstances topic in the book. And maybe if you want to highlight what happens in these extreme circumstances, like the space station. I think that's what you're referring to, isn't it? Or part of that?
Yeah. So people started studying boredom in these places, and because they worried about the mental health of people in these extreme circumstances, whether you're on a space mission or doing what we call winter over missions in Antarctica or the Arctic. These winter over missions, you get disconnected from the world, they're extreme in the sense that your physical well-being is in peril. You can't, just go outside and do whatever you like. And so the main thing for me, I think, in those circumstances is that you are constrained. There are things that you might want to do, but that you cannot do. So that constraint on your agency is a pretty good recipe. And you're also facing having to do things in a very routinized way, because if you don't, your life is in danger again, right?
So you got a triple problem or a double problem there, potentially extreme boredom, but you got to be attentive. Yeah,
that's right. And so when we study these things, it's harder to study in a lot of ways because there tend to be small samples. We send 2 or 3 people to space at a time. We send a dozen people to Antarctica, so we don't have a lot of data to go with. But what we do find is that boredom is quite a prominent problem in these extreme environments. Another way to consider this in a sense in which you wouldn't normally put these two together, but is to also think about prison populations, right? Again, if your physical capacity to act is constrained and the day-to-day things that you do in your life are routinized, that's going to be a pretty good recipe for boredom. It was interesting talking to Chris Hadfield, because he's one of these guys that says only boring people get bored, right? And claims that he never got bored. But as our conversation went on, it was quite obvious that he does get bored. He just doesn't call it that, and he deals with it very quickly and effectively. And he put me on to a Russian cosmonaut whose name's escaping me now. It's in the book, but who wrote a book about 212 days in space. And he was up in the space station in the 80s and 70s or 80s. And his description was rife with descriptions of boredom. And part of it was about the fact that everything was routine. Part of it was about having to do things that he had no control over, because the central command was insisting that he did various kinds of physical tests to make sure he was okay. And he found that tedious and busy work. And part of it was being disconnected from the world. You're up in the space station or you're out in Antarctica, all your loved ones are somewhere else. So all of the people that you would normally connect with in meaningful ways, you can't connect with. So all of those kinds of things about extreme environments, I think, make them really good places for us to study boredom. And of course, there's we know a lot more then about the mental hazards of solitary confinement, which, you know, is probably a practice we ought to ban on humanitarian grounds, because you put people in solitary confinement for too long. And boredom is one of the early stage experiences of solitary confinement, but it very quickly turns to hallucinations and much worse outcomes for your mental health.
Yeah. And then you brought up constraint. Well, but can you point to in the story about the space station, there was an astronaut who found ways to alleviate his boredom through small things, if I recall correctly. Yeah.
So that was Chris Hadfield.
Oh, that was Hatfield. Yes. Yeah.
So he first described not ever being bored, but then he went about telling you how he could get joy out of the tiniest things, you know. And again, this is interesting in thinking about how we as just Joe Public think about occupations like this. So one of the things he described was fixing the toilet, because when you're up there, you can't call a plumber. So you had to be proficient in all systems on the plane, and you didn't want the toilet on the plane, on the space station, and you didn't want the toilet to back up, right? So, but he described pleasure in, you know, just that kind of minutia. And I think you described some surgical colleagues of yours who you know, enjoy the minutia of each operation, even if it's the same from one to the next.
Even if it's the same,
so, yeah, some people are good at directing their cognitive resources, directing and focusing their mind, and just, you know, in some sense, you know, just fully occupying their resources, their mind, and that helps them not really experience boredom for very long. I think, as I say, I think Chris Hadfield would get bored, but very quickly just dismiss it by, you know, choosing some other activity.
Yeah, when I was a house husband and not doing all this, I did find enormous relief by doing small household chores that were valuable to the family, you know, and to the enterprise. Fixing little things, taking care of issues for my wife, my daughter, you know, and I found a great deal of joy in all of that eventually. And that was one of the big ways that I was let out of that problem.
Yeah, we've talked a lot in the book, and we've talked a lot. I have a colleague in the UK who does a lot of work on boredom and meaning. And my fear about using the word meaning is that it's sort of laden with expectations, right? That
heavy
meaning,
expectations. Yeah.
There's somehow that meaning has to be grand, right? So if I'm not dedicating my energies and efforts and talents towards solving, you know, curing cancer, then it's not worth it. But that's just a completely and utterly wrong way of thinking about it. So you described doing small household chores, and the joy being that it's not just for you. You know that others will appreciate that. One of my great joys is quite bland. I enjoy being out and, you know, tidying up the garden. And so you get what you get out of that is you get a sense of progress and completion of a goal. And it's not meaning in that grand, you've changed the world sort of sense, but it's meaningful to you because you were acting on the world in a way that you chose, right? And I think that's the key thing that's important.
And along that line, I think you so beautifully highlight the sort of existential qualities of boredom and kind of the overall arc of life and the meaning of life in a sense, because the garden exposure or experience that you're just talking about, my little household chores, they can be a tremendous source of gratification and meaning and value. But there's also this quality of it just goes away and it's impermanent and keeps coming back at you. And in a sense, it's like the myth of Sisyphus, you know, they roll the ball up the hill and it comes back down at you. And I've felt sometimes like I look at it and I'm going to do all this again. You know, it starts all over again. And it really, for me, it's just like, okay, I get to be doing this again is how I look at it, you know, and I'm glad to be participating in the flow of it. But any comments around that, the philosophical side of this coin?
Yeah, the distinction is that Sisyphus isn't choosing, right? So when Sisyphus is rolling the rock up the hill, he's suffering some sort of punishment from the gods.
Right.
But you and I are choosing. And so I have exactly the same experience. You know, you spend an afternoon in the garden, it looks great because you've got rid of the weeds. And you know, it's not long before the next thought in your mind is, well, I'll be doing that in another couple of months, you know? But you chose when and how to do a thing. And it's that act of choosing that makes it meaningful to you. We tell a story in the book too about David Morgan, who was voted the United Kingdom's Dull Man of the Year in something like 2015.
Yeah.
And we don't do justice to David Morgan's backstory, but because I guess we're sort of trying to get a laugh, right? Like, but the idea is that David Morgan is obsessed with traffic cones. And he's got this massive collection of traffic cones, and you look at that and you think, oh my God, that's just and who would be his spouse? Like to have to live in a house with thousands of traffic cones. But the deeper backstory is that he was an insurance adjuster, and there was some accident that happened involving traffic cones. And in order to solve the challenge of whatever that accident was, he had to learn something about them. And as he did, he got fascinated by it, and so he kept going. And that's perfectly fine, right? It's a hobby or interest that he chose that gives him some sense of meaning and is interested to him. I'm sure he'd acknowledge that it's not meaningful in that kind of grand societal change way, but it's certainly meaningful to him.
To him, and it ends up being meaningful in other smaller ways to other people. That's the beauty of that. It often has a spillover effect, and it may not be so grand, but it can be very important on a smaller scale.
Yeah, absolutely. He's been meaningful to me, at least.
Yeah. And then if we could circle back just a little bit, you talked about constraints, and that's one of the 4 horsemen of boredom that you describe in the book. Can you talk about the 4 horsemen and to highlight the kind of the back end of the deal?
Yeah, so monotony is an easy one. That's probably the most common driver of boredom that people think about. When we first started thinking about monotony in the sort of as the Industrial Revolution was unfolding.
Yes.
People really started to worry about in part, on one side, the quality control of what's going to go through the assembly lines, but also the health of the people working on there if they have to do the same thing over and over again. So that's sort of the 100-year-old research impetus on boredom.
But I hate to interrupt you, but I just want to highlight, because you make the point, and this is something I've thought about a lot. We went from a craftsman era where people made things with their hands and they did things, like gardening or whatever, picking the weeds out, to automated production and working in a factory. And that was a major shift that impacted our mental world dramatically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we got disconnected from the things that we use. And you see it nowadays too, that people talk a lot about the right to repair, but how many of us know how, right?
I mean, we're lost.
Yeah. So monotony is the easy one in the sense that I think everybody can relate to that. If things are just unchanging, and there's been certain artists that have done things to push the boundaries of that. Andy Warhol's got an 8-hour movie that's just a shot of the Empire State Building, and I've not watched 8 minutes of that because I don't like boring things. But so monotony is kind of easy. The second one I think is more about meaning in a sense, and finding meaning, and making meaning, right? So as we've just been discussing, it doesn't have to be on any grand scale, but it does have to be something that you choose, and so that you make some meaning out of. The constraint then is, I think, constraint on action, constraint on your ability to pursue a goal. And you've probably had experience, and maybe the people who listen to this podcast have had experiences where you've gone to a lecture thinking that it was going to be engaging and stimulating and you're going to learn something, and 5 minutes in, you find that this is the most boring guy that you've ever heard.
Are you serious? In the academic world, we never have boring lectures.
I'd like to believe that. I really would.
Yeah, boy. They're all sparkling, engaging, and just riveting. Absolutely.
But then you can't, in many circumstances, you can't leave, right? You can't, you're stuck in there. So, and that feeling of being stuck, I mean, earlier on, I described this notion of desire for desires. That's a sense of feeling stuck as well. You're not physically constrained and stuck, but you're stuck without an avenue out, a way to eliminate your boredom. So those are the constraints. And what was the fourth one then? So
the challenge level of whatever you're considering. Yeah.
Right. And so that I think is really interesting in terms of sort of upper and lower bounds, right?
Right.
It's something, because I think everybody will resonate easily with something that's unchallenging, right? Let's say you've been a cardiothoracic surgeon and for whatever today you have to sew up someone's stitches on a finger or something. It's like, I don't need to do that. I get other people to close up these things. I do the really difficult stuff, right? So if you're under challenged, then you're probably going to be bored, and everybody recognizes that. But you can actually show that people get bored at the other end of the spectrum. So when you're over challenged. So there's work from a researcher called Erin Westgate and Timothy Wilson. They had people do a kind of, it was like an air traffic control task, right? But they could play with how difficult the task was. So you're looking at a sort of a radar screen, there's planes going across it, and you just have to make sure they don't crash into one another. I can have those planes going infrequently and slowly across the screen, or I can have tons of planes, going really quickly across the screen. And then they just asked people how bored they were at different stages of that challenge of that task. And when there were very few planes and everything was going slowly, of course, people said they're bored. But they also said they were bored when there were a ton of planes and they were out of control and they couldn't, complete the task properly. So we're sort of looking for a Goldilocks zone. We're looking for something that challenges us to stretch a little bit beyond what we know we're capable of. Because if you do things that you always know you can do, then you're not challenging yourself. But if you try too hard, so if I just sort of said, well, I think I'll just do cardiothoracic surgery tomorrow, you can't just jump ahead and leap into something that you don't have the training or the skills for. You have to sort of do it step by step. And so at that sort of point, you'll be overwhelmed, overstimulated, and bored because you can't connect with the material. You can't connect with the task. So I think boredom is more common at the under-challenged level, but it's not. It
exists on the outer side. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Are there any personality traits specifically in the world of personality research that lead to higher states or higher trait boredom or lead to more boredom?
Yeah. So we talk about the big five, which I'll probably miss a couple here, but extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, neuroticism, and there you go. I've missed a fifth one because it's not my area of research. But
conscientiousness,
conscientiousness. So I like people who fall on the good end of those things, because they're all spectrums, tend not to be bored that much. So people who are conscientious, people who are agreeable, people who are open to experience. I don't know about extroverts, that might not be the case, but those people tend not to be bored nearly as much. But it's not a big effect. It's not something that's explaining boredom, that much. They're sort of correlations, associations, and so and they're not overwhelming. We do know that essentially, if you're struggling with boredom, what you're doing is you're struggling with self-regulation. And so when we take other measures of self-regulatory control, self-control, we find that people who struggle with self-control also tend to struggle with boredom. And so this is something you spoke about a little bit in terms of your own childhood, things like impulse control, risky behavior, risk-taking, sensation-seeking. People with those kinds of challenges also tend to be bored a little bit more. There's, of course, a chicken and egg sort of problem, right? So am I bored because I need more sensations and I need more thrills, or do I need more thrills because I'm bored? And we don't really, there's not really any easy way to answer that. So yeah, those are the main things that I would say about sort of personality kind of traits. It's really just a challenge of self-regulation.
Anything on the neuroticism side of things? And I just for the audience, neuroticism it's a kind of a loaded term, but it refers to one's sense. A better way of thinking of it, it refers to one's sensitivity to negative emotions.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so there's been strong and consistent associations between boredom, proneness, and depression and anxiety. And of course, if you're high in neuroticism, you're also likely to be higher in anxiety, because as you say, you're paying attention to and focusing on those negative emotions. There's another way in which we think about this that is maybe not as well known to your listeners, but there's a sort of a distinction people make in terms of how we go about pursuing goals, right? How do you go about trying to achieve the things you want to achieve? And that distinction is a dichotomy, which is, always a bad thing because things are never dichotomous. But the distinction between it's called locomotion and assessment are the two ways that people might go about pursuing goals. The colloquial way for talking about a person who is a locomotor is that they just do it. They're people who just launch from one goal state to the next very rapidly and effectively. And they tend not to experience boredom much because they're always in motion. They're always doing something, right? The other mode, the assessment mode, is colloquially called the do the right thing mode. And these guys tend to ruminate on what are the best options for action. I don't want to make a mistake. So what are the best things? And I bring that up to tie it back into neuroticism and anxiety.
Yeah.
They're concerned about making mistakes. And this notion of a boredom-prone person sort of failing to launch into action, they're failing to launch because they're ruminating about what might satisfy them the most, or what might be the most enjoyable or stimulating or interesting. And because they're ruminating on it so much, they don't launch into anything and they stay stuck in that bored state.
Yeah.
And so it is that kind of, and one of the key things to bring it back also to mental health, one of the key facets of depression and anxiety is rumination. So those sort of ruminating sort of thoughts. And we know that boredom-prone people tend to ruminate more as well, in that same sort of way of, wanting to make sure they do the right thing, not knowing what the next thing is that they should do, and then eventually just not launching into action.
Yeah. That brings me to the negative consequences of boredom that you outline in the book. And maybe this is a good thing to pair with the idea of solutions for boredom, because we have, as you point out in the book, external potential solutions and internal ones. And it seems to me that the negative consequences of boredom are potentially too much in the external solution realm. Is that a good way of phrasing that?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of phrasing it. We have things at hand that we can turn to when we're bored, but they're not always good things. So, and it can be anything from overeating. So Moynihan and colleagues have done some work showing that when you make people bored, they tend to overeat, and they tend to overeat high sugar foods, not fruits and vegetables. Interestingly, if I go back to the mink, they tended to overeat when they were bored as well. So they would overeat food that was considered a treat for them. So you can start with something like that, but then of course there are other things that we are more concerned about, things like drug and alcohol use. And there's been fairly long-standing associations between boredom proneness and overuse of drugs and alcohol. There was a recent study too out of the pandemic that showed that people who were more bored during lockdowns were also more likely to smoke marijuana and to drink alcohol. They were the only two drugs that they asked about or tested. So, and clearly doing that without thinking much about it and without carefully considering the consequences of that in a long-term kind of sense is not going to be good for your mental health. We also know there's an association between boredom and problem gambling. And the problem gambling, I think, is interesting because, again, most problem gambling is associated with slot machines nowadays. Problem gamblers tend to use that a lot. They don't tend to be on, the poker tables or blackjack tables. And the slot machines that we have nowadays are just full of bells and whistles. They're really, really good at capturing your attention. My colleague, Mike Dixon, does a lot of work on this. And in a range of ways that he talks about the ways in which they capture your attention so effectively. But one of the things he talks about is what he calls dark flow. So the idea of flow is this, there's sort of lots of ways to describe it, but the easiest way is to say flow is a state of engagement where the rest of the world has just fallen away. Yours is so intensely engaged that nothing can distract you. It feels good. And you feel like you're in a really great zone of getting something done, and you're in that state of flow. Mike calls the problem gamblers issue with slot machines dark flow.
I see
because
that, yeah.
they feel the flow, but it has a terrible consequence for them.
It's got real bad consequences, yeah.
And they're there in part, not completely, but they're there in part because it does occupy their mind and they're not bored while they're doing it. And the other one that's very similar to that is what we call problematic smartphone use. So we don't all have to be going to the casino for slot machines, but we all have in our pockets this device that is also super efficient at capturing our attention. So it's got all of the bells and whistles and the social media and other kinds of things on it that we can while away hours looking through our phone on various things. without ever really stopping and considering, why am I doing this? Does this actually really matter to me? Should I keep doing it? Maybe your answer would be, I'm doing it because I'm just feeling lazy right now and I want to have some downtime. That's a perfectly good answer, but it's better that you ask the question, right? So that you're not just mindlessly attached to your phone. And we find that people who are more prone to boredom are more likely to have that kind of relationship with their phone. They're more likely to be mindlessly engaged by it and to turn to it and use it excessively.
I really want to highlight what you just said, and that is to ask ourselves, why are we doing it?
Yep.
What am I getting out of this at the moment? And I had to do that. I've had other guests on talking about attention and where we direct our attention and what is, and I realized, because they had the same suggestion, why am I doing this? To actually ask yourself that and to get out of the reflex of just doing it. And I think it's a pretty ubiquitous human experience that the more you do that, the more sort of, what's the right word here? Kind of existential, low grade misery you feel when you're done with it. I don't know what's the right emotion or feeling there, but it is very unsatisfying and kind of leaves you empty in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you certainly the people who talk about coming out of a session with slot machines, they do feel a lot worse and not better for the experience. So and I think the same will be true of just spending hours scrolling through social media, which is asocial media. So
yeah, that brings up our children, and you have a great graph in the book about in the discussion about, is there an epidemic of boredom in our society, and have boredom levels changed? And the graph basically shows, and you can go through the details here, but it shows when Facebook came in, and when they crossed 100 million users, and then when Instagram came in, and then Snapchat, and the two graphs are bored. This is related to Google searches. That's right, Google searches, and maybe you just elaborate on it and just tell us what you found there, because it's quite interesting.
Yeah, so we had a look at, because it's a little bit ironic that we're using the tool to criticize the tool, but Google gives you access to the kinds of searches that people have done over time, and so we looked at bored and boredom and depressed, and you could see that with the advent of these social medias, that the searches for boredom was continuing to go up. And so I often get asked when people are talking to me about boredom and social media, well, how can you possibly be bored nowadays? You have the world at your fingertips. You have, and I think the challenge is that we're bored because a ton of what's on there is meaningless. It's utterly inane. And also the way in which we engage with it. So I don't want to be a Cassandra sort of telling everybody that the world's going to hell and that the internet ruins your brain. I think the internet's fantastic. I think social media can be good. But we do have the propensity to engage with these things in ways that are not helpful to us. And so the graph just shows that these searches for boredom went up. And the book we started writing in 2016, and it was in the publisher's hands before the pandemic hit, right? So we had no chance to write anything about the pandemic, even though it came out in 2020. So I imagine that if we went back and looked now, there'd be a spike for searches of boredom in about March or May of 2020, where people were all in lockdown. But yeah, I think the advent of these things and we've just sort of had a rapid uptake of phones and social media. And so again, I don't think that they're all bad. I think you and I don't get to have this conversation without these tools, right? I don't get to communicate with my family in Australia without these tools. There's those wonderful things that they enable. But there is a downside to them as well that we ought to be paying attention to. Excessive use, and depending on which study you look at, it's between sort of 4 and 8% of people. Excessive use is going to be associated with poor mental health outcomes, and boredom might well be one of the drivers towards excessive use. We need to do some more studies on this, but it certainly looks like that could be the case. And it's, of course, particularly worrisome with our teenagers, because you started this by saying we'll talk about our children. You know, it's the teens that are using this more than the rest of us, and they're
And
in
their
a time in their
self-regulation is
lives.
not high. Their self-regulation is not
Right.
high. Yeah.
Right. It's at a time in their lives where self-regulation is a challenge, a time in their lives where the hormonal soup is going crazy.
Yeah.
And so the consequences are probably a little bit more exaggerated for them, and something we need to pay more attention to.
Do you have any thoughts about even younger children? I mean, it's not uncommon to see, and I've seen it at homes of friends, where basically the iPad and phone have become, you know, a full-time pacifier, literally, you know.
Yeah. I don't know if it was the AMA or another American medical association or developmental psychology association that came out not that long ago with recommendations for how much screen time you should give for a kid. So I don't want to say anything about that because I can't remember the exact number, but certainly there's work out there that people can look up to say, okay, what are the recommendations? I think when I think about it with my own kids, I think the key thing is still about agency, right? And how you interact with it. So we might have a tendency to demonize this thing now and say it's terrible, it's awful. We've got to make sure that they get off it. I think we should say we've got to make sure that they use it the right way.
Raise it the right way, yeah.
Yeah, and so that means I think sometimes when you see kids, very young kids with them, it's just a really convenient babysitter. And that can sound a bit harsh and judgmental of the parents that done that. And so I'll just own up and say, I've done that in the past. When, you know, my kids are now 17 and 20, but when they were younger, you know, I was not above doing that.
Oh, nor was I.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
categorically, yeah.
Yeah. But I think if we confront ourselves with it and say, okay, sometimes if it's a babysitter, you know, I bonk them in front of a screen with a Pixar movie, that's okay. But if it's occasional, but the rest of the time, don't just ban them from the devices. Interact with them on it. Or what are you doing? Or you know, can I do this with you? Or, you know, how do we do this together? How do we actually do something that's challenging? You know, and search things up. You know, and I think my son at the moment, the 17, or he's almost 17. He's building a Dance Dance Revolution arcade map. I don't know if you know what this is, but it's like, you know, a song plays on the computer screen and then you have to use your feet to tap arrows. So he's been building this from specs that he gets from various people who put videos up on it on YouTube and in Reddit forums. He's, you know, learning how to put force plates into play, to solder up things to a motherboard, to get that then into code that he can make it run. Those are great skills. He's learning great things, and he, you know, learning
and he's
a bit of
engaged. He's
woodworking.
fully engaged. Yeah.
Yeah. And he couldn't. So, and, you know, and in amongst that, learning how to spray paint, learning how to do a bit of woodworking, and so he couldn't have done it without the internet, right?
Yeah.
So you know, I think it's about how we interact.
Yeah, it's the old story. It's good until it's not, and there's so much good, but it's how you use it and not overdoing it. Yeah. Well, this really leads us to the key piece here, and that is the internal solutions. That's where the action is. And you say the solution to our boredom has to come from within. And of course, we can take on these external solutions. You know, I'm just going to watch Netflix or do this, and, you know, I'll have a snack or something, but ultimately those are going to fail in the long run. And the solution has to come within. And so can you tell us about that? And you've alluded to it with your son, of course, you know, I mean, to a large extent.
Yeah. The disclaimer I want to start with is that we haven't got a lot of research on this yet. It's the $64,000 question that everybody wants to know, you know, how do I learn to live with my boredom better? And we just haven't done enough. We haven't really done much research at all. I have colleagues in the UK that look at boredom in educational settings where it's clearly it's prominent, and we would really like to do a lot more about it. I was talking with one of those colleagues a couple of months ago and said, you know, has anybody done anything to look at how to cope with boredom in the classroom properly? And he's like, no, it just hasn't been done properly yet. So that's my disclaimer. We don't have data. But the kind of thing that we'd start with is a sort of three-step process, I think. And the first one in this is maybe not the obvious one, but it's to sort of take a deep breath. I've described boredom as a motivational state, but I've also described it as restless and agitating. You know, you're not comfortable when you're bored. And so I think that when we turn to these external sources, It's because we're trying to get rid of that discomfort. And you're not going to turn to good solutions under those circumstances. So if the first thing that you think of is, I'm bored, this is terrible, it's horrible, the first thing you think is, just calm down, take a deep breath, and don't succumb to that agitation. I think that's a really important first thing to do.
In other words, what is your
thing,
relationship to the boredom?
Right.
Really? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The second thing then is to say, why am I bored right now? And there's tons of answers to that. It could be because there's nothing I want to do. There's always something to do, but there's nothing I want to do. It could be because I'm feeling constrained, you know. So I'll come back to that lecture, you know, that we
Right.
joked that, you know, no academic lectures are boring. There's a great article from Sir Francis Galton in 1882 where he sort of describes measuring people's levels of fidget while they're in a lecture. Well, so he was bored and he decided to measure something else, right? So even when you're constrained, you can think of something else to sort of do, but first consider, what is it about this thing that's boring me right now, and can I reframe it and make it into something else? So Galton reframed the whole thing, and he reframed it to be, now, because he was always measuring stuff, I'm gonna measure people's fidget. There's a great sort of anecdote in there too about assembly line workers, that we do sort of think of that job as being mind-numbingly boring. So how, you know, but clearly people do it day in, day out, so they must have a way of coping. Well, a good number of people don't feel bored on the assembly line, and they find ways to reframe the task to make it challenging to them. So they might say, I'm going to try and better my personal best in the last hour. You know, like I did 30 widgets last hour, I'm going to try and do 31.
Right. Little competitions. Yeah.
Right. And so they've taken a thing that seemingly is boring, but they've reframed it to make it not boring. So you can do that. You know, you calm down, think about the why is this boring, and is there a way for me to reframe it? And that'll help you with the in the moment situations that lead to your boredom. And then the last one is that bigger one, to say, okay, what matters to me? What are my goals in life, big and small, right? I've said it already that I don't want to give the sense that, you know, your goals have to be massive. Well, your goal could be, you know, am I going to fix that shelf that's crooked in the garage today? Okay, I'll go and fix that shelf, get it done, right? Or it could be, am I pursuing the career change that I was looking to pursue? You know, am I actually doing things actively to make that happen? Or it could be about, you know, personal relationships that you have. But the reason to sort of suggest of think about what are my goals is because boredom gives you that opportunity. We don't often do it. We don't often sit down and say, okay, what are the things that I care about most? And am I actively pursuing them, or am I actively cultivating them? Those two questions, those two things are the hardest things about responding to boredom. So boredom tells you you've got to do something else, but then it stops there. It doesn't do the hard work of what that should be. Yeah. And so if you can spend a little bit of time thinking about what your goals are and whether or not you've given yourself the room and space to actively cultivate those goals, then I think you can find ways to get over the boredom.
You know, there's almost a daily dichotomy in our struggle to live along these lines. I literally mean that. You know, on the one hand, every day you're potentially faced with getting bored and the opportunity of external solutions. And then there's the other side. Okay, I could do something that matters to me. And I'm just speaking now from personal experience, but in my work with other surgeons and coaching others, I know this is not uncommon. Right. And that is, okay, you know, it feels harder and more mentally challenging to get up and do something that has more meaning or matters more to me. The easy escape route of, you know, the other stuff is so alluring. And for me, anyway, I have to have the discipline to actually just say, get up and get after it, you know, the things that matter to me, because I know that the other way is not good for me. Any thoughts along that? I mean, it really does boil down to that.
Yeah, no, I think that you've characterized it really well. And I also think that it's viable in some circumstances when you're feeling bored to skip all of the steps that I just went through and just get up and do something.
Just get up and do something. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, the key challenge there is is choosing those things that are good for you in the end, and not those things that are bad for you, right? But getting up and walking around the block or something, you know, that's not going to hurt anybody,
Right.
and it just gets you out, and maybe don't put headphones in, and just give yourself a chance to think and to contemplate these kinds of things. That's one of the more viable therapies for depression is known as activation therapy. Is just get
Right.
people off the couch, right?
Yeah.
So, and when you're in that restless sort of state and in boredom, I think that's what you want. You want an avenue to discharge that energy that you've got, because you've got the energy, you just haven't got the avenue. So it's just find
Yeah.
the avenue and get out there. But you're right, it is a challenge, a daily challenge, and it's not easy at all. I don't want to give people the impression that it's just
Right.
simple. It's
That's
not.
what's my point. It's not easy often. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close to the end here, and I just want to bring up meditation as a tool. You know, I started meditating when I left clinical practice, and I would say that it is probably one of the most important things that I have started to do in my life. Whereas before, I think I was operating often in a trance, I would call it, you know, a trance
Right.
of responding to urges and boredom and everything else just sort of going on, rolling through life. And it afforded me the ability to interrogate myself and understand what my feelings are, my emotions, and know what's kind of going on under the hood, instead of the hood, what's going on under the hood controlling me entirely. It
Right.
gives me some agency over all of this. And I found that, and as Sam Harris, and I do want to categorically and unabashedly promote the waking up app that he has. But he says, if you're bored, you're just not paying attention, you know? And I think there's some truth to that. And it really has influenced my life dramatically in the small ways. When I'm with somebody, paying attention to them, listening. When I go on a walk, I pay attention to the beauty of nature. And this may sound corny and ridiculous, but it's true. I mean, I see mushrooms, I see birds, I see things that I was really often oblivious to before. And it's afforded me a great sense of joy and just general meaning about being alive. And I want to thank meditation for at least getting me partly out of the trance. Do
Right.
you know what I'm talking about here?
Yeah, I would bounce a question back to you immediately, though, and ask, how long did it take before you felt like the meditation practice was being effective? Because I'm going to guess that it wasn't the first week or the first two
Oh, no.
sessions, or
Oh,
first three
no.
sessions, right?
No,
Yeah,
no.
and so I hear in your description of all of that it has done wonderful things for you, and there's certainly no doubt that that's true, and there's good research showing the benefits of this. People, for maybe the last decade or two, mindfulness meditation has been almost fad-like for anything that
Yes.
ails you, right?
Yes. I agree.
And the concern I have with that is that to get the best use out of meditation, it has to become a daily practice, and that takes
Right.
a ton of effort. And so people just need to have realistic expectations before they launch into that this is going to take practice. And the best meditators have been doing it for years. My concern, I guess, is that people who suffer from boredom, people who are boredom prone, struggle to focus their attention. And what do you need when you're meditating? You need to focus your attention, right?
Yeah.
So it sort of it runs the risk of setting some people up for failure to say, I think you should turn to meditation. I think rather I'd say something like, you should turn to meditation with your eyes wide open about what it will take. It won't be a magical solution in the first month or two. It will take maybe more like 6 months before you feel like you're good at meditation. And when you feel like you're good at it, then it will confer all of those benefits that you just talked about.
Yeah, and I want to underscore and agree completely with you about the time course on that sort of thing. But the other part of meditation is that when I started, I was striving and trying to become good. And that was a real block for me to make progress within it.
Right.
And once I let go of that and I just sort of did it without striving, everything started to change. And the other thing about meditation is, unlike lifting weights or going for a run where you feel the effects immediately, this can be a challenging entry point when you start. It's kind of like, and you don't start to see the impact until one day when you suddenly realize, oh my goodness, I've kind of changed a little bit here in terms of how I'm reacting to something or another.
Right.
So it is a slower process, but one that is, in my opinion, definitely worthwhile.
Yeah, lots of great rewards.
Yeah. Well, James, thank you so much. I hope I didn't bore you in our conversation.
Not at
You
all.
must, I can't help but use all these little puns here, but it was really great. I so appreciate you taking the time to spend with us here and educate us.
It was my pleasure. It was great chatting you.
This has been The Resilient Surgeon, a podcast brought to you by the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this podcast, please rate it 5 stars and let your friends, trainees, and colleagues know about it. On social media, you can use the hashtag #BeYourBestSelf. More information about the Society of Thoracic Surgeons is available online at sts.org.